roof. And so in 1917, in my grandmother's village of Felshtin, people were planning to leave. My grandmother had been married the year before, in 1916, in Brooklyn, and was already starting a family. Did she have a way of communicating with her parents who were still there in Felshtin? We don't know. But she and her brothers were safely in America at this point. In 1917, there's a Zionist meeting. Very quickly, however, things snowballed out of control. World War I is in full swing. People are routinely being rounded up if it is suspected that you don't have your loyalty to either the Tsar or you don't have your loyalty to the White Army that is fighting for the liberation of Ukraine from the Russians. There are all of these movements. There are private armies. There are 3 large armies, each one trying to come out with a different result. The Jews are not part of any of that. They're caught in the middle. And therefore, in the scene on Fiddler on the Roof, you're hearing all of this rumors of war. And so they say, we're going to leave. We're going, one says, I'm going to Palestine. That's the Jewish homeland. And the people who were in Palestine were Jews because they were Palestinian Jews. So one person says, I'm going to Palestine. The other person says, where are you going? I'm going to Chicago. Oh, very good. I'm going to New York. We'll be neighbors. This is what they thought. And so off they go. And it's a good thing that they did, because in my grandmother's village in 1919, in February, there was a horrible pogrom. The soldiers of the Ukrainian nationalist general Petloria, who was a violent anti-Semite, who had spent all of his young years studying for the Russian Orthodox priesthood in a Russian Orthodox seminary. He was studying to be a priest and might actually have been ordained. He became the general of one of the army factions, and they go through Jewish towns, and their routine practice was to pull families out of their houses, hack them to death in the streets in front of each other, so that then they could go into the houses and loot and grab anything that they might take. And for Petlura's army, particular practice was immediately just hacking off arms, and they would leave people to bleed in the street. There are survivors who hid in haystacks and in attics, who gave vivid eyewitness testimonies of exactly what happened. 10 years after it happened in 1929, the people who had originally come from Felshtin and had heard all these horrible reports sent money to bring the survivors over to America. In 1929, they published a book with all of the accounts. The book has 11 chapters in Yiddish, 1 chapter in English. I have a copy of the original book, and the details are horrific. The book is now in the process of being translated. But again, for my grandparents, when they thought of Christendom, they only thought of rape, pillage, and destruction by people who were wearing crosses around their neck. I'm not saying this to make anyone feel bad, but you need to recognize that this is a very real and has been a very prominent part of Jewish history, and is one of the major explanations, along with several others, for why Jewish people put up a hand, especially older Jewish people, will put up a hand and say, no, I don't want that religion. I know what it did in the Holocaust. And so this was a precursor of the Holocaust. So the pogrom was very horrible. There were many, many deaths. So you see there some of the, in your outline, some of the results of these anti-Semitic movements. In your outline, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. This is, very simply, an anti-Semitic hoax. It is a booklet. It is purported to be the minutes of a secret meeting of this Jewish cabal, this Jewish secret group that actually controls the world. They control the weather, they control everything, they can control your, whatever. So put on your tinfoil hats, and concoct a new conspiracy theory. So this conspiracy theory was fabricated by a rogue journalist working for the Russian secret police. He was trying to stir up anti-Semitic sentiment, and he comes out with this, in essence, this novel, but it purports to be the minutes, the official minutes of a meeting. And it comes out around 1897. In about 30 years ago, scholars uncovered a book that was written in the 1860s in Russia that actually turns out to be the novel that this man stole, would just lifted, he would plagiarize entire sections out of this book. And no one had ever known about this book until scholars found a couple of copies in some dusty old libraries. But that was the origin. So in 1912, you see here on the PowerPoint an edition published by a Russian Orthodox propagandist. There are individuals in the Russian Orthodox Church who are extremely viscerally, violently anti-Semitic. They really embrace the teachings of one of their saints, a man by the name of Chrysostom, who lived around the year 400 AD, who preached violent anti-Semitism against Jews. They have icons of Chrysostom in the churches. And if you ever take an advanced course in an evangelical seminary, an advanced course on homiletics, on the science and art of preaching, of constructing a message, invariably they will use Chrysostom as a wonderful example of how to put together a message. Because Chrysostom had an ocean of production. And there were many sermons he wrote. When you look at them, there's nothing wrong with them. But there are many others that are not quoted that are pretty horrific. So this becomes something that starts to sweep through Europe, and eventually it sweeps through America, and you see the evidence right here. Henry Ford did more than build the Model T. He was also pretty much a vehement anti-Semite. That's been attested to by a number of his acquaintances who reported private conversations. Henry Ford, in essence, was a white supremacist. That's how we might to categorize him today. My eyes are open. I recognize that there are all kinds of shades in this, but there's no way of getting around that idea. He did lots of good things. I don't deny that. But in addition, he spent his own money. He used his own money and published into English. He had translated and then published in English a copy of the booklet, The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. He then used his publishing empire. He had owned a number of papers. As he's making lots of money in the car industry, he buys up newspapers, sort of like Randolph Hearst was doing at the same time. He's buying up newspapers, creating syndicates, much as our current news system is now being bought up by corporations. You have very little independent local news. Everything is owned by a syndicate. And the national news is all fed by satellite. And so you have fewer and fewer sources of news. And this was a wave that happened in the 20s and 30s. It subsided, and now it's happening again. So he publishes this booklet. 500,000 copies are distributed, and he says here on the front, every patriotic American must read these protocols. This is going to be in reaction to the growing numbers of Jewish people in America who are now assimilating. Okay, so Jewish people wanted to rapidly learn English, to learn correct English. They wanted to embrace the American dream. They were going to pay taxes. They were going to serve in the army. They were going to serve. At one point in the New York City police force, there were thousands of Jewish policemen. Okay? Yeah, there were tens of thousands of Irish cops. I understand that. But there were large numbers of Jewish policemen. They wanted to embrace the American dream. And yet, Henry Ford, who considered himself to be an evangelical and has credentials for being an evangelical, he bought into a false narrative of what the Jewish people are about. While the vast majority of evangelicals have always had a very sympathetic and properly biblical understanding of the Jewish people, that no, they are not some satanic organization, the vast majority of evangelicals have rightly understood that. There has always been in the evangelical community in the last 150 years a sort of a subset of individuals in the minority who held on to easily disprovable, ludicrous anti-Semitic ideas. I saw that. I've experienced it. Just nonsensical questions. People hold on to theories that have long since been disproven. But again, we live in a world where people are holding on to some flat earth theory because someone produces a few cleverly designed YouTube videos. So it wasn't difficult to convince people of this. So the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in the 1920s influences a generation of people who were disposed to this to be anti-Semitic. And this would in many ways give because it had a sort of historical scientific pseudo-truth to it, for people who wanted to ignore 90% of the facts and simply believe 10% of this fraudulent concocted theory. If you just put on blinders and look at that, and you ignore 90% of the facts, then you can give a defense for why you believe this nonsense. And so that's why it's important to, all truth is God's truth. We need never fear of tracing down the truth to its origin, because we're going to discover that all truth is God's truth. So we don't have to segregate off certain facts. We don't have to help God out by not posing difficult questions. There are difficult questions, and sometimes we, as ordinary believers, don't know the answer to all of those questions. But all truth ultimately is God's truth. In America, anti-Semitism is increasing among certain people. Other people are embracing Jews. Intermarriage starts to go up. People are interacting with Jews. Jews are having an influence in various ways in the world of entertainment, in the world of mass media. So people are becoming familiar with Jews. Europe at the same time is still very much suspicious. So very quickly here, Alfred Dreyfus is a French army. He's a career officer. He grows up as a boy saying, my greatest goal in life is to be a French officer. Vive la France. He was a guy who was all for France. And his Jewish ethnic identity was not secondary, it was like tertiary, it was off to the side. It was not something he thought about, but he was fully Jewish. He comes from an assimilated Jewish background. He assumes his French loyalties will endear him to his comrades, but they focus on his Jewishness. They falsely accuse him of spying for Germany. They concoct a story that later in court is exposed and proven to be a complete fabrication. He goes to trial. One court convicts him, and he is sentenced to imprisonment on Devil's Island. There are movies about it. Later on, another court, which was comprised of judges that actually were fair and didn't predetermine the outcome, they looked at all the evidence and they said, how in the world could this earlier court have convicted him? This was a setup. These documents are fraudulent. What's the lesson to be learned? That's really the most important thing here. The lesson to be learned is anti-Semitism is irrational to the human mind. Why? Because who is the author of anti-Semitism? It is Hasatan. It is Satan. It is the enemy of our souls. Satan is using anti-Semitism to drive a wedge to separate the Jewish people from the Jewish Messiah, because he well knows the scripture that says, in the day that the Jewish people say, Baruch haba b'shem Adonai, blessed are you who come in the name of the Lord. In that day, Mashiach returns. The return of the Messiah is the beginning of the end of Satan. And so he's trying to forestall that. And what better way to do that than to cause the people who outwardly say that we are Christians, we are followers of this Jesus, to then cause them to commit acts of violent anti-Semitism. Of course, the people who commit the violent acts of anti-Semitism are not Christians. They're not followers of the person or the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. They are individuals who have their loyalty to a church institution, to a high, sort of fancy church institution. So the lesson here is that anti-Semitism is irrational because ultimately it is satanic. Partial assimilation doesn't appease. A journalist is sent from Vienna to watch the proceedings of these trials. And the journalist is a man by the name of Theodor Herzl. You see his name up here. Theodor Herzl is accomplished in several languages. He's a journalist. He thinks of himself as an Austrian, a Germanic. He loves that culture. And he just thought, well, if we assimilate enough, if we look like everyone else, if we look like this handsome Frenchman, Alfred Dreyfus, then people will accept us. We don't want to look like those, Jews from Eastern Europe with the long black coats. We want to look like Europeans. This is the paradigm that this young journalist, Theodor Herzl, embraced. If we just assimilate, they'll like us. But of course, Herzl is thinking from a rationalistic sort of point of view. He did not yet come to understand that anti-Semitism is irrational. By the way, Herzl is spelled incorrectly there. There's no E at the end there. It's just ZL. That's how it's transliterated. So Theodor Herzl covers the trial, and he is shocked because he saw the evidence that would have exonerated Dreyfus, the evidence that would come out in the second trial. That was suppressed in the first trial, it comes out in the second trial. And Herzl has this, this moment where he is crushed as a European, but then he flowers as a Zionist. He says, my pride in being European is gone. We have no future here because one country by country by country, they're going to find a reason to persecute or expel us. By this point, the early chalutzim, the early pioneers, the word chalutzim, chalutz is a pioneer. The early chalutzim had already been in the land for a full generation, from the 1880s. They joined the already existing Jewish community in Eretz Israel. Jewish presence in the land didn't start with that first wave of immigrants in the 1880s. They joined an existing community. There were Jews in the four holy cities of Jerusalem, Tiberias, Tzafat, Hebron. All of those cities had permanent Jewish settlements for thousands of years. They were the remnant. And so the first wave of immigrants go. Theodor Herzl dismissed that. He said, why are you going there? It's malaria-infested swamp and desert. This is foolish. Look at Europe. It's beautiful. This is our future. But with the trial of Alfred Dreyfus, he has this moment where he is both crushed and then very quickly hope springs anew when he realizes that the future of the Jewish people is there in Israel. So the early seeds of Zionism come from the shifting political situation in Europe. The uncertainty, you cannot plan that your children are going to have the same house in which you have now labored to buy. There's a complete uncertainty because political events are so rapidly shifting back and forth that there's this shaking up, and you have no idea what's going to be in 10 years. So people who thought, we're Frenchmen, each new generation is becoming more and more French. We have a home here. This is our home. They thought that. But with this rising anti-Semitism, that hope was shaken, and their eyes looked toward the east, toward Zion. And so these are the early seeds of the Zionism movement. We have an entire course here for 1 week, 2 weeks actually, where we teach the history, the early history of Zionism and history of the State of Israel. So I'm not going to go into a great deal of depth. We have that teaching, and that comes around on the normal cycle. So the early pioneers of Israel join the people who are already there. So here we need to make a couple of very simple statements. The Encyclopedia Britannica identifies and defines Zionism as the Jewish nationalist movement that has as its goal the creation and support of a Jewish national state in Palestine, the ancient homeland of the Jews. Notice the last phrase. That's the wording of the Encyclopedia Britannica. It's a rare nod to reality. In subsequent editions of the Encyclopedia Britannica, this is an older edition, this is like from the 1950s, 1960s, this was simply the fact. Today that would be contested. Our good friend Dr. Michael Rydelnik, anything he writes, I immediately suggest you buy. Do you hear that, Michael? The belief, so Michael Rydelnik writes, the belief that the Jewish people rightfully have an autonomous state in their ancient homeland. He has an economy of words. We need to make two very simple statements. Zionism is not intrinsically racist or anti-Arab. There are Zionists who love the Arab people. One of the most wonderful things that you could ever do is spend some time in the land of Israel attending the Messianic assemblies, attending the congregations. By the way, some don't choose to use the word Messianic. It's a totally different culture and context in Israel. And so simply respect, please respect the local identity and understand that they understand their context. You're going to go, and then you're going to leave in a few weeks. They've got to live there. And they've had too many Western believers coming over and telling them what they need to do or what they should change. They really need to follow the Lord. And so learn, listen, keep your eyes open, and if you do, you're going to see that in many of the congregations, there are elders who are Jewish believers, there are elders who come from the West who are Gentile believers, and there are elders who are Arab believers. The Messianic Assembly on Rochov HaNevi'im, where we worship for 3 months in Jerusalem, is an example of that sort of thing. Jewish elders, Gentile elders, and Arab elders. And so Zionism is not intrinsically racist. Are there Zionists who are racist? Sadly, yes, there are some. And that is a shanda, as we say in Yiddish. It's a shameful thing. Why? Because we hold to the biblical truth that all people were created in the image of God. From my kishkes, I believe that, because I've seen it in action. So Zionism is not intrinsically racist or anti-Arab, and Zionism is not intrinsically imperialistic. Jewish people of Israel have zero desire to take over Jordan. Believe me, they don't want to take that on. They have probably zero desire to take over lots of land that is currently Arab. They simply want to live in Eretz Israel. So it is not intrinsically imperialistic. Whereas the religion of Islam has as one of its core values imperialism in taking over new lands to try to impose Islam, which means submission. And it often will do this initially first by friendly means, by building, Muslim mosques in countries that allow that, bringing Muslim immigrants in, and then ultimately there is a violent shaking up if the country does not agree to Islam. That has been the historical truth. Our current situation is very different in some ways, and I'm not trying to comment politically on what is currently happening, we need to genuinely extend respect to every human being that comes in our pathway. So this is where we're going to pick it up tomorrow, talking about the development of how Zionism becomes the state of Israel.